Good morning. Let's give Rachel a really loud round of applause. So while I am getting all my papers in order, and thank you to the AV team, because I think when I sat on the microphone, I muted it, so I apologize for that. Why don't you greet each other while I'm getting organized here? Just some, whatever makes you comfortable, some love, some hellos. When you're ready, come on back. So we are on part 3 from the 5 invitations. And this book, as I have shared before, has had a profound effect on me and will continue. If you could see my book, not only is it so lined and highlighted, but the front cover is so dirty from me grabbing it, I got to clean it off. But the first invitation, we're going to just review very quickly, but you can go back and watch the videos, but really go get the book. First invitation was don't wait. It was about change being constant, hope as our innate human quality, forgiveness and all of its benefits, and appreciating the preciousness of life so we don't live in regret. We live in the now. Because what Frank Ostaseski has done with his thousands and thousands of hours in serving thousands of people through the death and dying process, he's taken the wisdom from that and grief and his own pain and his own suffering to give us these tools to actually live fully in the now. Second invitation is welcome everything, push nothing away, which he talks about openness being the basis for a skillful response in life. Acceptance is not resignation. We let go of the self-image we've created to keep ourselves protected, and we release the resistance of pain that actually causes more suffering. So this week is bring your whole self to the experience, and we're going to talk about don't be a role, be a soul, taming the inner critic, the raging river, and hearing the cries of the world. So, don't be a role, be a soul actually comes from the spiritual teacher Ram Dass, who talks about bringing our soul, our presence to life. Because, we understand we're spirit in this human realm, right? We understand that, but we do have these roles that we play. And Frank invites you at the very beginning of this chapter to imagine that there's a photograph of you that's a puzzle, and you take all the puzzles apart, and you're going to put the puzzle together. But as you're noticing, there's certain pieces that you don't like. And you don't want to put them in there. Oh, I don't like that jealousy, or I don't like that way I snapped at my kids or my parents, or I don't like the way I get so annoyed about this. And we start realizing there's aspects of ourselves that we're closing off by doing that. And we have to bring ourselves to the whole experience by understanding the wholeness. So we often talk about wholeness and spirituality as perfect, whole, and complete in the spirit realm, but he's also saying that our wholeness not only includes the joy and the good, but includes what some people may call the broken, or the parts of ourselves that we don't accept. He says wholeness does not mean perfection, it means no part left out. And when he talks about the role versus the soul, he had this awareness as he was helping, because it's exhausting. It's you're in the pain and suffering when you're working in hospice. And there's one man, John, who was dying of AIDS, and Frank was trying to help him, and he was exhausted, and Frank's in the bathroom, and things are just literally a mess. And Frank is feeling overwhelmed while John is sitting on the toilet, and John whispers, "You're trying too hard." And what Frank realized, he was afraid to enter helplessness. Because you can't help somebody die. And you can't stop the process. He had to acknowledge his own helplessness, and it invited him to slow down. Because he had this role of a helper. I've got to help you. This is my job. This is my role. This is how I'm being, a caregiver, which he then later on reveals it's more about service. And he says it helps you soften up and truly serve when you realize that you can just be present to what is showing up next. That roles aren't good or bad, it's just, expected behavior, but how often do we claim things for ourselves as a role or an identity, when you experience some type of, maybe a disease or something in your life, and he says, look, we're complex human beings. We need to stop projecting our stories or these roles onto other people. And what he noticed was the helper's disease, as he called it, but what he saw was also the opposite, that sometimes there's so much pain and suffering that we cut ourselves off. And he noticed that with certain doctors and nurses. They became cold, they became uncomfortable, they became indifferent. This one woman's, days away from death, and this nurse is like, well, maybe we should give her this medication. And Frank wasn't trying to be rude. He's like, maybe you need the medication, because she couldn't handle the suffering, which is a human experience. It's overwhelming. So he says, don't be just the role. Bring in your soul. Be that beneficial presence. He says, don't offer unsolicited advice or impose on other people. Just be present. So as we understand, God in, through, and as us, present. Bring your best self forward. Bring your love forward, but also let the pain be there. So when he was in the hospital after his heart attack, he lost his stability. He, all his Buddhist practice went out the door. It was overwhelming. And he at one point was just having this meltdown, and he went into the bathroom, and they're banging on the door, to get him out. And he's like, let me be with myself. And all he needed in that moment was love. He says, in the chaos of illness, one calm person in the room can make all of the difference. He says we can be a reminder of stability and confidence. So whether it's illness, whether it's stress, whether it's overwhelm, whatever loss or experience that you're having, allow yourself to be present. And then if you're that opportunity to be the calm in the room, be the calm in the room. Because service is a heart intention, he says. There's this embodiment of love. It's unselfish, and it's not trying to help fix somebody, because that's draining. It's just a renewing energy that we bring into every moment. And he says we do this by being authentic in the moment, right? He says by being authentic, you build trust. So there's this story of this intern, medical intern, Athena, and her job was literally to go in and pronounce the death of people, and it became very disheartening for her. She felt like it was just too mechanical. And what he invited her to do was to move into being a soul. He goes, you come from a lineage. He goes, you're taking this oath that goes all the way back to, what's his name? I can never tell his name. Hippocrates, yes. He goes, you're taking that oath. And the lineage of the doctors that came before you, because her grandfather was a doctor. He goes, bring your soul into this experience. And so what she started doing is that whenever she had to enter into the room, after the other nurses, had to, take down all this and take down all, the machines, she would actually pause. She would light a candle. She brought like this rose anointing oil. She anointed the forehead of the body. She said a prayer. She had her grandfather's stethoscope. She called on the ancestors. And in that moment of blessing, she was calling the death, but she was blessing that soul that is now on its other journey. And he said that was the shift from the role to a soul. She started bringing her whole self forward. He goes, because when we bring our whole self forward, that's when we're able to be present in the love that heals. So think about in your life, where have you showed up as the role? Where have you projected onto somebody because they have a certain role? And where in your life have you showed up as the soul, as the presence? Whether it's lovingly greeting each other here, inviting new people in. Think about a time that maybe you forgot, but now you can remember that in every moment you can be that soul presence, that divine presence, that love. In the room, you can be that calm, you can be that stability, you can be that confidence. And then if you're the one in the grief, we invite that calm and stability and confidence in. Because we're ever moving through our feelings and emotions as human beings. He then talks about taming the inner critic, because he's talking about bringing your whole self to the experience. And he goes, no matter how hard you try, you cannot please your inner critic. So who has that nasty voice in their head that says things that, are just not kind? We all do. It's part of the psychology of our beingness. And he calls it the enforcer. This enforcer demands compliance and a standard of moral codes. It's brutal. It's this pursuit of perfection. It's ego-based. And he says it eclipses our journey of wholeness. He says when we bring our whole self forward, we include our quote-unquote brokenness. But when he talks about the inner critic, he goes, we're being invited to disengage from that negative voice that's actually seated in us in childhood by the adults in our lives. Because they are unhealed. And they have experienced brokenness. And they have that inner critic that's in their being. We can shift to what they call in psychology the inner advisor, but we call the wisdom of God, the love of God, the voice of God. Where you can then know that wisdom, strength, and love is being called and not that voice. See, I always tell the inner critic, I go, I know you got something to say, but you need to say it nicely. You need to be kind. Because I don't want to hear that nonsense anymore. Hurts my feelings, all right? But he talks about how it gets seated in us in childhood, and that his son, Frank's son, when he was little, built a fort that he'd go back, whenever he needed some space, like underneath this small desk. And, and Frank is very honest about, his own growth even as a parent. But he said that years later, he pulled that desk, and what he found were all these like cuss words and angry rants at his, that his son wrote about him, and that his son had no way to express that aggression and that anger towards him because it's too dangerous, so they repress it, and instead he wrote it out. And he said, when we are small, the adults have all the power. And that is what then feeds later on in life that inner critic. He says we've learned to maintain approval and avoid shame and punishment by bending to the adult's wishes. So as he sees like his son's expression and he starts realizing how he's carried on his own shame and judgment, he's coming into this place like, how can I move from judgment to discernment? So I'm bringing my whole self to every experience, because that judgment can be harsh. It will shut us down. That critical voice is not the truth of who you are. And that's our process, and for us, that's our spiritual practice to cultivate that. It's almost like with a glass of muddied water and you're dropping drops of clear water, eventually that mud will clear. So our spiritual practice allows us, our prayerful practice allows us to cultivate that inner wisdom, because we want to make space for that wisdom and that love to flow. But it's a practice. So he says in taming the inner critic, we have to understand that all that we've experienced is a result of things in our past. So he was in the spiritual community, and the lead organizer of the community created something that wasn't in the best interest of the community, and it pushed Frank out. So he no longer had a community, and he was angry, and he was feeling hate towards his leader. And years later, he's thinking of it, and he's watching his hand do like this chopping, motion. And if you've ever, like at the Upaya Zen Center, I meditate with them online, if you've ever watched them, there's this statue of this Bodhisattva, Manjushri, not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, that has a sword. Now, if you don't understand the wisdom of what that statue represents, you're going to think, oh, violence. No, the sword is able to cut through ignorance and the entanglements of diluted views, he said. And so what he realized when he was doing this chopping, he went to his image of this Bodhisattva that is cutting the ignorance so that wisdom can prevail. So what our tradition calls forth is that we allow what's being present, but we move into that prayerful space, that higher consciousness that the wisdom and the love of God reveals in this moment, but we allow whatever energy and emotions we're having to be there without judging ourselves so that we may heal. Because if we're going to bring our whole self forward to any experience, it's that continued revelation and healing, and that we just bring acceptance forward of our feelings. We befriend ourselves and our quirky parts of our personality, and then we get curious about these innate qualities of our being. If we can remember that the inner critic does not hold power, that what we are aligning is that divine wisdom, that divine love, because who's ever had an experience of the divine, of God, that was gentle and loving? Because I have. In those moments when I'm just on my knees in my younger years praying and this presence just comes forward. That the inner critic, which is about the ego, goes this way, because that love that is infinite, that is divine, is far vast and more powerful than that voice that we grew up with. And so we befriend our personality and we befriend our innate qualities, but we don't have to befriend the inner critic. We can just say, no, thank you, so that we can be who we are. Because we have no idea how that voice impacts us or how maybe we've impacted others. I remember, I don't know if I shared this the last time, I remember I was finding notes from my nieces and nephews, and I must have been really cranky at dinner because I wrote an apology note to my niece Monica. I'm like, I think I did share this story. It's like, I'm so sorry, I'm so, grouchy at dinner, and here's some candy for you, and share it with your sister if she wants it, right? And then she wrote back the note, and she actually said, thank you, I love you, and she left me a candy, all right? So I didn't want to be that seed. I didn't want to have that voice be a part of her inner critic. I wanted to acknowledge whatever I was experiencing, the difficult emotions, because remember, we're not trying to not be human. We're going to have difficult emotions, but we want to bring our best selves forward. So Frank tells the story of Matthew, a gay man who's dying from HIV. And he grew up in this fire, brimstone, his dad was a preacher, God is punishing, you're going to hell. And it stayed with him his entire life that he wasn't loved or worthy. Even though he was a Buddhist practitioner, that was the inner critic that was flaming literally at his death. And so Frank heard the story, he knew the background, so he took out the Buddha stuff and he brought this teeny tiny plastic Jesus. And he puts it on the table, he creates like a little altar. And then the woman who was coming in to clean, Diana, comes in and she sees it and she's getting ready to mop, and with great enthusiasm she says, "Oh, merciful Jesus, when his kindness is with us, everything is all right." And Matthew shifted towards her. And in that moment, he was healed of the voice of his Father, because Diana's love was so pure, and she gave him this absolute understanding that Jesus is love, Jesus is kindness, Jesus is merciful, and he was able, days later, to die in peace because that inner critic stalked him his entire life. So the invitation is that love in that moment, that's what healed him. He says that love is what helps sets us free. Love is the ally that makes acceptance possible. And he says, however, we often confuse acceptance with approval. And he says acceptance is a loving act of an open heart. And approval is generally tied up with judgment. So where in your life are you still tied up with judgment? Because of the past. I have had a deep healing with my father, who experienced such trauma as a childhood, in his childhood, that what I realized, he showed up the best way that he could. Because I expected more, but then he shows up the best way that he could. But he is living in his own judgment from his own father, leaving. And I realized this is how he showed up. This is how he loved us. He sent us to Catholic school. He gives me paper towels when I come over. This is his way of saying, I love you. This is his way of saying, that's his heart opening. And instead of having judgment, I want this. I'm like, no, I love you just the way that you are. So the invitation this week is to look at how the inner critic may be haunting you now in your life. Where is that place of forgiveness? Where is that place of healing? And where's that place of stepping forth and allowing love to lead the way? Frank then goes on to talk about the raging river, which is grief, right? He says it's not easy, and it's not easy being human. We have these joys and we have these sorrows. We have these highs, we have these lows. We have the smooth, we have the prickly. It's all part of our experience. And he said that mindfulness is what's going to support us in cultivating a merciful, awake presence of a mind that no longer blocks the heart. Inner critic blocks the heart. Judgment blocks the heart. Projections block the heart. False expectations block the heart. And he says, then things are free to be as they are. Because he says sometimes what is over there seems more valuable than what is right here, but being who you are can only arise from accepting who you are. And he says if we have the ability to have those moments like he did with his daughter of a holy revelation, of the stories and the projections, as opposed to just being present to what is. Remember, acceptance is not resignation. This is what's happening in the moment. That then he said we can see those inner dramas. And then we, instead of getting lost in judgment or reactivity, then those inner dramas can reveal wisdom and love, which is essential for our spiritual growth. But he reminds us that, with mindfulness, we're embodying these feelings, and especially if you've gone through the loss of a loved one. Just recently on Facebook, someone lost their son, their teenage son, in a car accident. I could feel the grief in my heart. I can't even imagine that loss. And he says that we cannot repress it, because it lies underneath the surface. He goes, and sometimes we can express it, but it could be reactive. He goes, contain it with a response that just allows the reality to be present, just allows the feelings to be right here, the pain, the suffering, and that grief, he says, is a normal process. It's a natural response to loss, because loss is inevitable. And in those moments of pain, instead of trying to shut it down or numb it, just to be with it, is what he's saying. Because we all have lost someone, and we all will lose someone, and we all will someday go. And the invitation is, when I understand that, then I can be fully present and engaged with you. I can be engaged with what I'm feeling and my expression, but I can also be engaged with you so I can live deeper and fuller in every moment so that there's no moment wasted. But he talks about the difference of the experiences that are happening in grief. All right? Because we've all have these responses, and it's changing and it's constant. And he says grief doesn't go away in a day. It doesn't go away in a week. It may not go away for years. He goes, it's a process, because first you're dealing with loss, then you're dealing with the losing, and then he says eventually there's what he calls the loosening. But what we come to realize is that in this process of the raging river of grief, the intensity of grief, there's also the intensity of life, and the intensity of joy, and the intensity of beauty. Because Brene Brown talks about joy as foreboding joy. Like, it's so good, it's so joyful, but now I'm thinking something's going to happen. And what Frank is inviting us in life is just to be present to all of it. The raging river of grief, but also the intensity of love, the beauty of a sunrise, the harvest moon that's now named after my great niece who was born on the 29th, Caroline's moon, all of it. As one is born, this woman on Facebook who I call Alma the Angel, Alma Krovat, passed away in her 90s, but she prayed for everyone. There's this cycle of life, and what he's saying is, in the loss, there's the acceptance, but the acceptance may take time. It may take time to realize when you're sitting with the one that you love. This woman, Linda, had to tell the story of her sister because she couldn't believe that her sister was dead. Because she went into the room, she's like, she was just here. And Frank allowed her to tell the story so that loss could then just bring itself here. And he said, losing, these are painful states of mind because grief is disorienting. And this is where there's nothing for you to do but be with the grief. Walk with the grief. Don't try to avoid the grief. Allow the grief. Find people who love and support you. And then when he's talking about the loosening, he's like, allow that feeling in your heart to be present. He says, in the end, we may still fear death, but we don't fear living nearly as much. He says, in surrendering to our grief, we've learned to give ourselves to life. And that is the whole point of this book. When we understand the difficulties, the challenges, the pain, we can also understand the beauty, the expansiveness, the awareness of the way that God shows up. And so the last thing he talks about is hearing the cries of the world. Because we are unique, we are undifferentiated, but we are not separate. And he talks about how meditation evokes compassion. And that compassion is that strong motivation to reduce suffering. And it can be overwhelming. So what Frank does, when there's been a lot of deaths at the Zen hospice, he'd go get body work, he'd get a massage, all right? And he would cry throughout those sessions. Second, he meditated, because he wanted to regulate the emotions and just be present. Regulation doesn't mean stopping, it's just allowing the flow. And then the third thing is that he would go rock babies who were born of mothers who were addicted. Those were his 3 ways of being able to be through the process of grief. He says because when compassion is there, that means there's pain and suffering. But then we can wake up and bring that healing agent of love and kindness. Because he says love has been there all along. And that is our reminder. Love is always with us. Love is always present. He tells one last story of Roshi Bernie Glassman, who was given a talk in Germany. And they had the I'm terrible with words. Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva, I know I didn't say that right, which is the deity of compassion. And it's seen with thousands of arms, all right? And Bernie's talking to like 500 people in the room about being that compassionate presence, bringing that love, bringing all your practices into just the moment. And this one man raises his hands, he goes, I only have 2 hands. And Bernie goes, no, you don't. And he invited, let's do it. He invited everybody to raise their hands, so raise your hands. Everybody raise your two hands and take a look around the room. Now, we don't have 500 people here, but take a look around the room. These are the hands of God, all right? Hands down. This is the love of God. And what he's saying is, he says that we can't do this by ourselves. We are intimately connected. And our hands, my hands, your hands, all of our hands come together. Come together to support each other, whether it's the grief process, some kind of loss, some kind of transition, because something has to be let go for something new to arrive. And so it's that we cannot leave something out if we're going to bring our whole self to the experience. Be a soul. Be that presence. Tame that inner critic. Invite the wisdom of God and the wisdom of love in the moment to reveal itself so that voice no longer commands and demands from you to be less than who you are, which is a holy revelation of the light of God in your life. And allow yourself to feel and embody those difficult emotions, because grief is difficult, loss is difficult. This is the human experience. We can have all of it by bringing ourselves forward and finding people in this spiritual community, which is why it's so important to have community, that in those moments when you just need to cry, you are held in the arms of love. This is why we gather. We gather for our own life, and we gather to support each other in that love. And then, when you hear the cries of the world, compassion is being called forth. Love is being called forth. Bring your best self forward. Bring your whole self forward. Allow the other parts of your personality to be fully present. But in the end, we realize that this is our human incarnation that has these experiences, and that's what makes us whole. Leave no part of yourself out. So let's just take a moment and breathe into this awareness. I know that was a lot of good stuff from beloved Frank Ostaseski. And just breathe into this moment, feeling that presence of God in your heart. Whether there's pain or joy, sorrow or ecstasy, love or hurt, let it be present. This is how spirit in this human experience reveals itself. We call forth greater love and greater joy and greater life, and we also allow that embodiment of the mindfulness of the moment. But in this moment, what I know is that there's one power and presence that is God, and all of this is an experience of the divine in each of our unique incarnations. We are the space and the place from which that grace that is God gets to reveal itself in every moment. And we also are that space and that place in which we get to receive the grace of the moment. So when we bring our whole selves forward to this experience, we're bringing the understanding of our divinity and the fullness and wholeness of our humanity, and we allow all of it to be a part of our experience. And we mirror to others the way to walk with love, to walk with compassion, but also to allow ourselves to walk with grief, to be in that raging river, but to know that we are indeed supported, and we call in that love when necessary, and then we share that love in all moments. And I know that God has got all of this in this mystery called life. So let's breathe together in this moment in great gratitude for the work that Frank Ostaseski has done and has inspired us. But let's breathe into this moment for our own self-love. That inner critic then turns into that absolute wisdom keeper of the divine in every moment. That as we grow and glow, others can see the difference, and then we bring that energy into the world, and we create that place of peace, so that peace is available to all in the moment. So I breathe in gratitude for each person here, each person listening. I breathe in gratitude and love for the experiences that we have. I give thanks for a community that does stay together, knowing that this is so important and vital for our well-being and our wholeness, to walk this journey together, and how beautiful it is to know that we are not separate. We are not separate. It is all God. So I breathe in knowing that all that has been revealed is the way that Spirit decided to show up. All that is received is what's necessary for each one of you in the moment. And to know that indeed that we are loved, we are supported, we are loved, and that we heal in every moment and reveal the allness of God into the best of our ability. As we breathe in and we breathe out in gratitude, I just let go. Knowing that it is so, I let God and I let it be. And we affirm it together by saying, and so it is.